Hi, and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a caricature of Steve Carrell, or the character he played in Anchorman, Brick Tamland. This is the second of 4 different caricatures I'm going to be doing, all based around the movie Anchorman, released I think in the early 2000s or so. And again, Steve Carrell is going to be the main focus of this caricature. Now, if you looked at the previous caricature I did of Ron Burgundy, or Will Ferrell, there was mention of the fact that we were going to be doing more of a caricature of the character than the actor themselves. This one's is a little bit different in the sense there is a little bit of the Steve Carell face in here, and mostly based off the idea that there wasn't a lot of costuming involved in this particular movie for this particular actor. Mostly this is just a matter of him combing his hair over to the side and putting on a pair of glasses, as opposed to some of the other actors who went with full wigs and mustaches and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the caricature here, one of the things I really focused on was the shape of the face and of the mouth specifically. I am very familiar with Steve Carell, mostly from his days playing in The Office, a TV show. And one of the things that always very much just struck me about the actor himself was that he has a very, very tiny mouth. Or maybe it's better to say that when he is trying to pull off certain looks or certain expressions on his face, his mouth can get very tiny. And it is a kind of a source of a humor, a kind of a reaction that gets a lot of laughs when he was doing the sitcom. And it's something that he, I think, carried over into the Anchorman movies as well. Now, the character he's playing, Brick Tamland, in this particular movie, is a very simple man. He's kind of explained in the very beginning of the first Anchorman movie as somebody with a very, very low IQ. And I think they even diagnosed him as mentally retarded. I think it was one of the big jokes there as well. I guess depending on whether or not you find that to be funny. But the point of the matter here is that he is very simple and very simple in terms of his mentalities as well. So when he makes statements, when he's stating a punchline or a joke in the movie here, again, his mouth gets very, very tiny. It's a look that he gets on his face to kind of express that kind of blank emotion. That means that he, even though he may be telling a joke, doesn't necessarily get the joke or isn't in on the joke per se. And that tiny little mouth is just something that I really kind of focused on inside this kind of capture of the character, if that makes sense. So if we know that the mouth is going to be tiny, then everything else has to achieve some sort of a balance around it when it comes to the rest of our face drawing. Now, one of the things that also is very prominent on Steve Carell is the tiny chin and something of a larger nose. And I don't know that he necessarily has a nose that's bigger than the norm, as much as it just looks bigger compared to the tiny mouth underneath of it. So again, if we're shooting for that balance here, this drawing is really kind of meant to give an example of how that works aesthetically. Tiny mouth, large nose, very tiny chin under it. And then the rest of the head here kind of comes out into balance. Now, when I say balance, something I've spoken to in some other caricatures I've done before is this idea of balancing the top of the head with the lower portion of the head. Which area, and when I say, balancing here, I'm kind of talking about the eye line. Draw a line along your eye line there and notice, what has more mass, the upper portion of the head above the eye line or the lower portion of the head below the eye line. And determining which kind of has more mass can help develop where you're going with the shape of your face. So there was a lot of mass below the eye line, even though this chin was very, very tiny and it was coming up together almost in a point. So where did all that mass come from? It's got to come from the nose, because since it's definitely not coming from the mouth or an overly plumped lip or anything like that. The rest of the body was a little bit interesting to draw in here. I've been drawing a lot of shirt and ties and business suits lately in my caricatures, just because of the people that I've been choosing to draw. So the body here kind of went in pretty quickly. Although there were some differences here that kind of made this a little bit interesting to draw. For instance, a lot of the business suits that I draw don't tend to have a vest, so drawing a vest on this particular character was pretty fun to do. And I spent, I guess, a little bit more time than I normally would, focusing on some of the details in the vest, like the buttons and the little wrinkles that'll go around the buttons with them when the shadow comes in a little bit later. Yeah, little things like that. The eyes were particularly interesting here as well. You can see me kind of starting the inking right now, wanting to make sure I get these eyes right. Depending on the person you're drawing here, you really kind of want to focus on the elements that really bring the resemblance home. And in this case, with this particular caricature here, the mouth was something I kind of honed in on, focused on, but the eyes really kind of draw a lot of resemblance as well. If you go to various, sources of knowledge when it comes to drawing caricatures and resemblances and likenesses, even portrait artists will tell you the same thing here. This little T-zone that they tend to refer to is a place where you draw a lot of resemblance from as well. Now, the T-zone is that area that kind of connects between the eyes and the bridge of the nose coming down. Again, I tend to focus on mouths a lot because I find a lot of resemblance comes from the mouth, but that doesn't mean you disregard the eyes and the nose. They're a big element here as well. And if you're just starting out with caricatures and just trying to kind of figure out how to develop your style in the way that you draw the people that you're drawing, again, resemblance a lot of time is going to be found in that little T-zone that I mentioned before, and really kind of helps to focus on the shape of that T-zone. And what I mean here is that if you take a look at this T kind of shape, it is thick around the eyes because the eyes are relatively large. If you have squintier eyes, it's going to be a thinner area. It'll create like a different shape of a T, and then using that kind of T mentality can help get some basic shapes down to determine what you're going to be exaggerating and what you're going to be focusing in on when it comes to developing your caricature. So a little bit of a cheat here. You notice how quickly the background went in, and it's because I decided not to redraw it. This is just a copy and pasted background from my Ron Burgundy drawing that I did about a week or so ago. I didn't really feel any need to recreate the wheel on this one. Mostly I wanted to focus on the character and the lamp that we're looking at anyway. And by the way, if you're noticing the lamp, you may have an idea of where this little joke is going. So, stay tuned. We'll see the culmination of all those efforts in just about a minute or so. But again, I basically just copied and pasted the background from the Ron Burgundy caricature that I did before. Now, I mentioned this before. Let me kind of get a little bit of detail here. This is the second of four different caricatures I'm going to be doing, all based in this world of Anchorman. So if you go back to one of my previous videos, and I'll put a link for it up in the corner there. There is a Ron Burgundy video already posted, and a little bit later on, I'll be doing the other two characters from that little kind of Channel 4 news team that was the main character set of the movie. All right, so as we go in here, notice that there's going to be some heavy shadow as well. This is mostly just because of the light source. I wouldn't typically do this on a lot of my work. It can be very drastic in terms of the lighting, but the big bold shadows here that are covering a good portion of our figure are mostly because we have this extreme light source of the lamp sitting next to him. So even though it's not terribly obvious right now, once this whole piece is done, this lamp is going to be on and lit up and be the main light source. So we'll add some shadow to the background, some lighting to make it look like the lamp itself is glowing and shedding some light, and our figure here has to reflect that. No pun intended with the word reflect there. So I'm kind of testing out my light colors right now, just deciding whether or not they work with the jacket color. This is a very unusual kind of orange color that I'm working with. But the main reason I chose the orange color for the suit is to make sure that it contrasted very much with the blue background, so that opposite color kind of helps everything pop and at least gives some sort of illusion of depth if it's not already covered in the shadow and the light rendering. So I'm fairly happy with the color of the light source that I chose, and what I'm doing here is just kind of painting it in on the jacket and smoothing it out with a smudge tool. And I have my smudge tool set to the soft airbrush setting. So to be clear here, when it comes to brushes, I'm not really using anything that isn't already created in the toolkit that comes with Procreate when you initially download it. I am really only using 3 main brushes at any given time. I use something of the sketch or pencil brush just to kind of get my rough outlines laid in, or my rough lines of what I want to kind of do with this. There's no reason I use this particular brush other than the fact that it just kind of feels like a pencil to me, and that's the way I've always kind of worked in the past. Being somebody that has a little bit of a history with pen and ink, the second brush that I use is one that mimics some sort of like an inker brush. The thing that I like about it is that it allows me to get variation in line. Line thickness is what I mean by that. So there are going to be areas where the lines are thinner, areas where the lines are thicker, and this just kind of goes back to my old history of like loving comic books and how they're drawn. If you ever take a look at how inkers work through comic books, that line variation and the thickness to thin offers at least some hints of depth and allows a character to kind of pop off the page. It's not true three-dimensionality, but it does kind of help to think of some of those thicker lines as the beginnings of forming shadow, if that helps make sense. So again, brush number 1 is a pencil type brush. Brush number 2 is an inker type brush, and I use that same inker brush for a lot of my coloring as well. So anything you're seeing in here in terms of some sort of a basic fill as a mid-tone is really just with that inker brush, doing just a general fill for the most part, but then coloring in with it almost like it's a crayon when I have to get into some of the finer points. Now, when I get into the shadows and the light rendering, it's really kind of the same thing. I mean, working in different layers with different blend modes, but when it comes to the brush itself, it's still that same inker brush, just set to different thicknesses, and then I will use the smudge tool set on an airbrush in order to be able to do some smudging. Occasionally some light and some shadow rendering I also do with that airbrush tool, so that really kind of gets to our 3 main brushes there, the pencil, the inker, and then a soft airbrush if I need some kind of like softer lines or softer edges. Those same three brushes are used quite frequently on the smudge tool or even on the eraser tool, so I really don't deviate from the three all that often. Occasionally I might need a little bit of a texture, and I will kind of use a texture brush for that. Again, not really delving outside of the Procreate toolbox for the most part, and the only real example of it you're going to see in this picture that I'm doing today is in the hair. So when I get into the light rendering on the hair, which should be coming up pretty soon, I'm basically using the same method I've used a lot of times before, which is essentially just kind of sketching in with the inker brush some light coloring, and then using the smudge tool with a soft airbrush to kind of move it around and kind of smudge a little bit and just kind of give us some general movement and sense of kind of blend, so to speak. When that's done, though, I'm going to draw back over it again with a different brush, and this is a marker brush, a felt marker brush, and that's just used to kind of get some impression that there's some individual hairs in there catching the light or catching a shadow or something like that. Again, the intent is to give it a little bit of texture, so I was just looking for any sort of brush that gave any sort of a texture, because ultimately the line was going to be so thin it wasn't going to read very well anyway. But I just wanted something that would give a little bit of variation line and not just look perfectly straight or have a perfect edge to it like the ink tool kind of does. So again, anything with a texture was going to work in this sense, and when you see it kind of get sketched in there really quick, you kind of see what I'm talking about. Right now, I mentioned this before, and I want to kind of get into it again. I am putting the light rendering in on the lamp there, so notice how we kind of get just this general kind of glow, and this is coming just from the soft airbrush, so no special tools here really being used. I'm just kind of getting it in, and it's looking a little bit streaky to me, so I'm going to go back in with the smudge brush and kind of help kind of blend it a little bit better. This is where I'm kind of getting into the hair, and you can see that effect that I'm talking about before. I've gone in and kind of moved in some just general light shape with the inker. Smudging it is going to smooth it out a little bit, and then a felt marker type brush, or anything with a texture really, on a very small point, is going to come in and just kind of put in some of the individual hairs just to give it that illusion that there is some texture in there. Again, I'm not overdoing it, I just want a hint of it, so I'm not really concerned with what the texture is, as long as it reads as something other than a smooth edge or a smooth line. So this was really kind of simple, and there isn't a whole lot of depth put into this. The background was pretty simple, so there's not going to be a whole lot of time spent rendering that either. The main thing I wanted to make sure I did was just kind of represent the idea that he was occupying three-dimensional space. So in addition to kind of putting some light subtlety around the lamp itself, I also put a cast shadow behind him to make it seem as if that Channel 4 news background is just something of a wall that he's standing against, with a lamp sitting slightly in front of him. And we're going to finish this thing off by putting in our big punchline. So we'll remove the little 4 dots that represent my color palette in just a second, throw in our little word balloon telling us that I love lamp, and if you're familiar with the movie, this hopefully is quite hysterical to you, and we will get the final coloring in there and a signature, and we will call this a finished piece. Again, I got 2 more of these coming up in the near future, so if you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and leave me a comment as well. I got more coming soon. Make sure you come back, stay tuned, and thanks for coming by today. Take care.